David Stewart, in your view, should Andrew Johnson have been impeached?
I think so. Sadly, though, not for what he was accused of.
What was he accused of?
He was accused of violating the Tenure of Office Act when he fired Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War. It was a constitutionally shaky statute and was ultimately found unconstitutional. And it might not even have applied to what he was trying to do. So that particular accusation wouldn't have moved me a lot. I think he could properly have been removed from office, and it might have been a very good thing if he had been, for undermining the congressional program of Reconstruction and, frankly, refusing to enforce laws that were the laws of the land about the most important issue that was then facing the United States. But because high crimes and misdemeanors is such an elusive standard, there was a feeling in Congress, which we still have, that there has to be a crime. And not enforcing the law the way you're supposed to didn't feel enough like a crime. So that's how it ended up being the Tenure of Office Act.
As a lawyer, do you support the phrase high crimes and misdemeanor?
Well, as a lawyer, I'm stuck with it.
But it can also work to your advantage as a lawyer, can it?
Well, it can. It's quite unclear. When the framers of the Constitution adopted it in 1787, they weren't quite sure what it meant. It had dates from 14th century English law. It was archaic in the 18th century. People didn't have a real understanding of it, and we don't now. The Senate has been very dedicated to never saying what it means. It's whatever any senator thinks it means. So it is an unfortunate phrase in some respects, but then again, it gives different senators a certain amount of freedom when they are approaching an impeachment. You see, impeachment is a combination of a political process and a judicial process, particularly with the president. High crimes and misdemeanors feels like it has to be a court case. It has to be, a crime. And there's the word. But in fact, you're decapitating one branch of the government. You're removing the president. It's a big deal. And that's a political decision. 54 senators voted on Andrew Johnson's case, and 54 of them voted for political reasons. And so high crimes and misdemeanors is a bit of a blind. It's sort of a distraction at some level. But it's what we have. So we do the best we can with it.
How did the charges against Andrew Johnson originate? Who pushed them? And how did they get to an actual vote in the Senate?
They really came out of a tremendous discontent among the Northern Republicans who dominated Congress at the time. The South was not represented in Congress at the time, who wanted effective Reconstruction, wanted real aid to the freed slaves, and wanted to keep the former Confederates out of power in the South. Johnson didn't share any of those goals. He was indifferent to the freed slaves. He thought the states could have whoever they wanted as in charge of them, and really undermined the congressional policy every chance he had. The result was you had a tremendous face-off, a lot of legislation vetoes, and ultimately it broke down into this impeachment crisis. In many ways, you can see this as sort of a tremendous aftershock of the Civil War. I mean, it really was still fighting over those same issues. And, who's going to have power in the South? Did winning the war mean anything? The Northerners were asking that. Why did we win the war if these people are still going to run their governments, if they're still going to treat black people the way they always have? And those were tough questions that didn't bother Andrew Johnson at all. And that's really where the conflict came from. And it had to be channeled into this argument over Secretary of War Stanton.
Who were his political allies and his political enemies?
Well, he had a real problem that he had been elected on a Republican ticket as Abraham Lincoln's running mate.
From Tennessee?
From Tennessee. And Lincoln wanted him as a war Democrat, as somebody who would appeal to Southern Democrats or Democrats. But he was a Southern Democrat, so he had this Republican sponsorship, but he didn't agree with any of the people whose team he was supposedly on. And then Congress excluded all the Southern Democrats from Congress. So his natural allies were not there, by and large. So his adversaries were the former abolitionists, people like Thaddeus Stevens, who was a wonderful figure, congressman from Pennsylvania, and his allies were the Democrats who went there. One thing you have to understand this period, you just have to do a mind shift that the Republicans were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives. And it's changed since then, but in the 1860s, that's the way it was.
Why did you write Impeached? Why another book on Andrew Johnson and his impeachment?
Well, one reason, frankly, is there aren't that many. There's only a couple, and I thought they didn't tell the story in a way that it ought to be told in its full context. And I was attracted to the story a lot personally because I defended an impeachment case myself, a judge who got impeached 20 years ago. So I've always found it a fascinating story. It's a bit of a train wreck in history. I mean, everybody's unhappy at the end of the story. He's acquitted by a single vote. There's a lot of evidence that historians have ignored that there was bribery in the final vote, and that senators were bribed to vote for Johnson's acquittal.
By whom?
By Johnson's cabinet members. They raised a bribery fund of $150,000 and entered into negotiations with a variety of senators and their agents.
That's a huge amount of money back then, wasn't it?
It was a lot of money. And there were people walking around Washington with just wads of greenbacks. I mean, we didn't have electronic controls and anti-money laundering rules then. People just had cash and they passed it around. It was a very corrupt time, to be blunt. And the corruption really infected the impeachment. So there's a lot in this story that is really pretty compelling.
How'd you do your research?
No, I spend a lot of time at the Library of Congress. It's a tremendous resource. Of course, the trial itself is, the transcripts all available. But, you have to get a feel for what people were saying to each other about it. You want to go to correspondence and original sources. And the newspapers, which were very partisan at that time. So you, again, get some insight into what people were saying about the figures, the issues at the time.
Was the American public at that time engaged in this impeachment process?
Totally. There was a tremendous fear that went across the country when he was impeached, that we were on the verge of a second civil war, that Johnson was leading a coup d'etat of Congress, and Congress was usurping the presidency. And there were headlines in the paper, 20,000 Kentuckians going to march on Washington. 10,000 Pennsylvania soldiers, boys in blue, are ready to march tomorrow. So there was a real feeling that there would be bloodshed. And, we'd been killing each other just 3 years before in the bloodiest war we've ever had. So these were people who didn't shy away from extreme solutions. So it was a galvanizing experience. And one of the things about the impeachment process that was, I think, very positive was it slowed everybody down. The lawyers got in, and lawyers slow things down. And it gave people a chance to step back and say, Johnson's term ends in 8 months. Why are we doing this? And I think for a couple of the senators who voted to acquit him, that was one of the reasons they did, was, this is a big thing to do with a guy who we can vote out of office anyway. So some parts of the process, I think, were pretty positive.
How long was Johnson the president? How long did this process take, and could he have gotten elected in his own right?
Oh, that's a great question. He served almost a full term. Lincoln was assassinated just 5 weeks into his second term, so he was very close to a full term. He very much wanted to run for re-election, and he wanted, of course, to be the Democratic candidate. He certainly couldn't be the Republican candidate. And when the Democrats met in their convention in New York City in the summer of 1868, on the first ballot, he came in second. So he was a serious contender. They ultimately went off on a dark horse, a fellow named Horatio Seymour from New York. And Johnson was an effective political campaigner. 8 of the 11 southern states were able to participate in that presidential election. So there was a base for this, for his appeal. He might have been a better candidate than Seymour was. He might also have been a more polarizing candidate, and that may have been a good reason not to choose him.